Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Resilient Aging Unfiltered podcast. I'm so excited to be here with Dr. Cindy Weinstein. Such an honor to have you here today. Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks for taking the time.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
I'm just going to tell our audience a little bit about you, Dr. Cindy.
Okay.
I'll eventually shift to just saying Cindy, I guess, since you gave me
Perfect.
permission before we started this. So, Dr. Cindy Weinstein is the Eli and Edythe Broad Professor of English at the California Institute of Technology and an Atlantic Fellow for Equity in Brain Health. She has written several books on U.S. literature with a focus on the 19th century. Most recently, she wrote with neurologist Dr. Bruce Miller from UCSF, Finding the Right Words, a story of literature, grief, and the brain, in honor of her father, Jerry, who died of early onset Alzheimer's. And this book received a 2022 Memoir Prize for Books. Wow. Currently, she is writing Always, Nevermore, The Unending Death of Edgar Allan Poe under contract with Johns Hopkins University Press and essays in another book, Essays in My Garden, a memoir, which continues her interest in brain health. She has outreach activities around dementia, including speaking at senior residences, in Alzheimer's disease research centers or ADRCs, and in health humanities programs. And she's also leading a Hilarity for Charity monthly support group called Keeping Each Other Company, Caregiving and Grief. Wow, that's so cool what you're doing. And
Thank you.
you're putting all these interesting things together. Um, well, I'd love to, certainly I'm going to want to learn more about your experience with your father, but maybe we can go even before that. And
Sure.
I'm curious about what led you into your career and then when and then if the brain health stuff even interest started even before your father started developing symptoms.
Sure. Well, it's great to be here, Dr. Cabral, i.e., Danny. And I was very lucky when I was a teenager. My mother, especially, cultivated a love of reading. We played Scrabble for hours and hours. So I always loved words and language and letters. And when I was 16, went to Phillips Academy at Andover, where it was a summer session. I read 12 books in 6 weeks, and I thought, this
Wow.
is what I want to do with my life. So there was this very nice synchronicity. What I loved, I was good at. And so I majored in English in college and really wanted to get my PhD in literature, and that all worked out, which was wonderful. What didn't work out was when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. It was my third year in graduate school. My parents were in Florida. We grew up in New Jersey. They retired to Florida, where my dad's fantasy, I think, was one unending round of golf after another. And that hit the fan
Mm.
relatively quickly. And I noticed in phone calls, because that was in many ways like the primary way that we related, that my dad's answers were short. He kind of couldn't wait to hand the phone over to my mother. I kind of knew something was up, but not exactly. And I found out later that my mother was hoping I would get through my 7 years of graduate school without knowing that my dad had Alzheimer's. She really wanted to protect me and wasn't sure that I would be able to do the thing that I loved, which was study literature, knowing that my dad was sick. And it was impossible in certain ways to do both. So I split in half and was happy, deliriously happy graduate student by day. And when the lights went out and I needed to go to sleep, there was a 200-pound elephant on my chest. And we're talking about the is and the everything. If there was a memory issue, it was Alzheimer's. There was no kind of precision diagnosis. And I only got that diagnosis when I started working with Bruce Miller, the person with whom I wrote the memoir. And he said, your dad had early onset Alzheimer's with the logopenic variant. And because I love words and because I think for so many years, we had this free floating sense of something so profoundly wrong, but having the label Alzheimer's didn't quite capture it, what my dad was experiencing. And so there was this kind of time where I was reading up a storm, studying from orals, reading a book a day, whatever. And my dad was losing words. And that experience haunted me, still haunts me, and it took me decades to figure out how to write about it. And my dad died in 1997, and I knew I wanted to write a book about him, honoring him. I loved him so much. And there was always another academic book that kind of quote unquote got in the way, or I wasn't ready to write the book about my dad. And then what happened? There was like a lull, like what academic book am I going to write next? And I was like, I think I'm ready to start writing about my dad. And I had drafted a chapter where we were in a supermarket in Berkeley, which is kind of the title of an Allen Ginsberg poem. And my dad wanted something in the supermarket and didn't have the word for it. And it turned out it was croutons.
Mm.
And writing that story of going through the supermarket was the point of origin for the book I wrote with Bruce. And I didn't want to write the book alone. I'm at Caltech, where people think in terms of cells and string theory and polymers and not Moby Dick and Scarlet Letter. And I think I kind of imbibed that and just had this intuitive sense that maybe if I learned a little neurology, maybe that's what I needed to write the book about my dad and write it with a neurologist. So that's a long answer to your question, but feel free to follow up.
It was perfect. Could you talk more about what your father was like and your connection to him?
Sure. I'm the youngest of three. My sister died of ovarian cancer several years ago, and I have a brother. I'm the youngest. I think the term daddy's girl is not quite as appropriate as it used to be. But in the 1960s, it kind of captures things. I just adored my father. I really did. I thought he was such a good person and very like we would go to a restaurant and he would always know people in the restaurant and kind of do the room and shake hands and be really social. And he had a very clear sense of right and wrong. And he had very high expectations for himself and for us. He took me for ice cream all the time. One of my favorite things was I would go to work with him sometimes. I write about this in the book, and I would answer the phone and kind of like be the secretary. Sometimes I would keep him company. He had an electrical supply place, which barely exists anymore. Now it's like Home Depot, whatever. And he had this big van. It was before everyone drove a big van. And I was really short and I would be in the van with him and keep him company. I tried to learn golf because he loved golf. I was terrible at golf. I really did what I could to make him proud of me.
And how do you think you achieved that?
That's a good question. I think so. Often I'll think, what would my dad do in this situation? And I try and do it. And that's another reason I think why I wrote the book. There are many reasons why I wrote the book, but one of them was my dad was incredibly generous, incredibly generous. He went to college on the GI Bill and made sure that my sister, my brother, and myself got really good educations. He helped with graduate school. My sister and brother were both lawyers. So he was really committed to giving us the best lives that he could. And at a certain point, especially when the book was very hard to write, each chapter was terribly difficult in its own way. I know that my father would have wanted his experience to help people so that other people wouldn't suffer the way he did. And that kind of kept me going. That kept me
Mhm.
going because I was worried when I wrote the book. I know there are a lot of ethical questions around representing someone else's story, especially without their permission.
Mm.
He had died many years before I wrote the book, but I know in support groups, people who want to share photographs, they're very conscious of the agency of the person with Alzheimer's and not undermining that in any way. And so I was nervous at times about, to use a fancy word, instrumentalizing my father's illness,
Mhm.
but I I kind of that was me being hard on myself, I
Oh.
think, which I totally get an A plus in always.
I bet.
But he would have wanted that, whatever he could do to make other people's lives better, he would have wanted that. So that motivates a great deal of what I do and what I did when I wrote the book.
Wow. The way you described being, I forgot the word you used, ecstatic graduate student by day, and I guess that's it can be such a hard time, grad school,
I
and so that
know.
it was so delightful for you is so but then you had this quite contrast, you know, when, it was quiet and you were in the evenings, yeah, but, then I was thinking how you end up at Caltech teaching English and, like, how fascinating and what so you obviously have this ability to oversimplify, like, use both sides of the brain or, like, you're able to integrate these things and connect with people who I mean, I'm sure there are many very talented writers at Caltech, but so you're choosing to be a bridge.
Right.
You're able to, well, speak different languages, which for you, that's not maybe that's a given. So in any case, I guess I'm just pointing out how fascinating it is, and
Thank
I
you.
wonder if that your father played any role in that.
Let's see. I think, it's a counterfactual. I would not have written the book had this
Hmm.
experience not happened.
Yeah.
And so there's that. My academic work as a US literature person has always been interdisciplinary,
Mhm.
bridging history, especially, and literature. And so I'm interested in just sort of the cultural context in which books are produced. And it never would have occurred to me that I would learn about neurology. And it's interesting
Mhm.
because I think about, like, I was at Berkeley in my 20s when my dad was getting sick. It never once crossed my mind to sit in on a biology class when I was at Berkeley.
Mhm.
And it's complicated because I think literature was both a container for my grief, like literature, especially the works I like, usually are kind of bummers. There's a lot of grief in literature, put it that way. And
Mhm.
so I think reading about other people's grief kind of helped me, but then it didn't because it was also a way to say, okay, that goes here, the grief goes here, but that's not me. And what I say in the memoir is that I kind of gave myself a shot of forgetfulness, anesthesia to
Yeah.
wear off the pain. And it took a very long time to wear off. I did a really good job of giving myself a big dose of, you know, kind of denial, but not quite. I think it hurt so much to think about my dad hurting so much that
Mhm.
I just couldn't do it until I was strong enough. And so that's why, it took like 25 years before I
Yeah.
could write the memoir. And, the grief never ends, but I have, in a weird way, like that is liberating for me
Mhm.
because there's this narrative about grief, especially in our culture, one and
Mm.
done. And, the stages of grief, blah, blah, blah. I just think that's nonsense. And so one thing, when appropriate, with the support group that I talk about, for the Hilarity for Charity Foundation, which is Just for your audience, if they don't know about HFC, it's the foundation that Seth Rogen and Lauren Miller Rogen created in honor of Lauren's mother, Adele, who died of early onset Alzheimer's. I share with the support group that I'll never get over how my dad died. And I don't mean to sound like a Saturday Night Live episode, but I also want to say, and that's okay. That is okay. And I think it goes against the grain of how we think about grief, but it's how I experience it.
How long was your dad sick?
So I found out about the diagnosis when he was 55. I think my mother knew before, and
Mhm,
she certainly knew about the prodromal symptoms, the things that precede the actual diagnosis.
mhm,
And then he died at 70. So for me, I knew officially for about 15 years. He was healthy as a horse.
mm,
He stopped eating meat in the late 60s, early 70s. He jogged 3 miles every day, and, so his body really hung on for a long.
mhm. And were you conscious of your own while his symptoms were progressing, were you conscious of your own I call them micro and macro griefs
Uh,
happening during?
could you define those? That's an interesting way of thinking about it.
So there's certainly big things that maybe when he forgets your name or doesn't recognize you, so that's a
Right,
big, you
right.
know, but there's more smaller things that were special to you. And I use an example sometimes of, a different context, which is a couple who's been married for decades and the husband has always opened the door for the wife
Mm.
and he has the Alzheimer's and then one day he just doesn't anymore. But
Yeah,
that gesture like means so much more than anything else. And
right.
so for that, yeah.
So that is such an interesting question because I kept toggling between those. So I write about this one moment where my dad and my mom used to love going to Las Vegas in September for their anniversary. And I was in Berkeley. And so once it was easy to fly and meet them there. And we had breakfast at one of the restaurants in the hotel, and my dad ordered pancakes and took the syrup in the plastic cup and just poured it over the pancakes, except he forgot to open the cup. And he thought it was going to come out, and it didn't. And that moment packed a wallop.
Hmm.
Another moment and that's probably micro. And then another one was he was in my sister worked valiantly to get him into a NIH protocol. And I went to visit where my parents were staying while my dad was in this program. And one thing I noticed was he kept opening his wallet and
Mhm.
like looking at the Medicare card, looking at the Social Security card, looking at the MasterCard or whatever. And I thought he was looking for himself. That's how I read that moment. I was constantly reading moments. And every time like a micro thing like that happened, it was like a blow. But because I was trying to be so stupidly cerebral about everything, I kept thinking, okay, if I lose it now, what am I going to do when the macro thing happens?
Mm,
And so it was like this accumulation of can't be upset now because
mm,
something worse is going to happen. And I was so silly as I'm describing this. Like I thought I could like rationalize the grief process. And what that led to was just all of these feelings and pain just kind of going underground in some
mhm.
way. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing so openly. I think I just wanna validate that that's our normal I think most normal reflex to try to rationalize
Mm,
what's happening in these ways, and it's too painful for our brains to handle, right? It's not comprehensible, but it's makes sense that we're trying. And that blow that you're describing when like the syrup and you know what I think about, and you could put words to this better than anybody is. To me, that it's all relational,
Yeah.
and the fact that this is so hard for care partners is because of all of these things that are hitting them and changing their relationship.
Right.
And so and it's but it's even impossible in that moment to process, and
Right.
it could take years even if you worked not maybe not, but if you worked actively on it and did all the proper grief work, but who
Right.
has time for that when you're, like, trying to just, like,
Right.
help your person, get
Right.
out of the house and get to
Right.
so I
Yeah.
just like, I'm always searching for and you could speak to, like, how to support care partners when it's clear, even if I hand them the most wonderful help,
Yeah.
"Here's all the help and support, everybody,
Yeah.
we're here to help you," and
Right.
it's still like, no, they're still
Right.
wrecked, right? So there's getting to that.
Wrecked is exactly the right word. And I should say one of the things I share with people in the support group and when I go to senior residences, I think a lot about what I wish I had done.
Mm,
And one of the things, and this is, I think, connected to, for me, the importance of learning a little bit of neurology, because a year of
mhm,
neurology is like you can order wine at the cafe in Paris, like you can just do that, but like you don't know a whole lot more. I wish in those moments I had said to my dad, like, "What are you doing?" Or I'm sorry you're looking for yourself, or how do you feel? And I say that because maybe my dad wouldn't have been able to tell me. Totally possible, but as we know, there are moments of lucidity, and maybe he would have said, "I'm so wrecked. Like,
mm,
I can't believe I don't know how to do this." And I think that could have helped him, even if just in the moment, and it could have helped me. Because I was in a bit of a hall of mirrors with my grief. And one of the things that learning about the neurology did for me was it shifted the focus from my brain to my dad's. And
mm,
was so helpful. And you're a psychiatrist, so I'm sure you have like a whole set of words to explain this. But so much of my experience of watching my dad in pain, it like immediately flipped to my pain. And I don't think, I mean, that's natural, I guess, but in the long run, um, it 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 was really out of whack. And part of the problem, and I don't mean to bury the lead here, but my mother had told us that she didn't want my dad to know what was wrong with him
mm,
because she was sure he would have taken his own life. And he had said things before the diagnosis along the way that if this had happened, he didn't want to continue. And we never had a name for if this happened. But I think my mom was probably right. If he had been able to hold on to what was wrong, he very well might have taken his
mm,
life. And so I think some of the things that I'm saying I wish I had done, I wish I had said, there was a honor my mother and father conflict here.
okay, fair enough. No, that's
Yeah.
huge
Yeah.
because you didn't know what would be on the other side of that question you could ask him.
Right.
And even when you
Exactly.
said it, like, it broke my heart because I knew he may express his pain and then you could join together and maybe move to an but also, you don't know, like, and you're still
Right.
young, this is
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So, this is so fascinating about your learning about neurology. Obviously, I love neurology.
Yeah.
So, can you talk more about that experience of connecting with Dr. Bruce Miller, and that how you came up with the structure and plan for the book?
I thought At first, I might be able to find someone at Caltech, to write the book with. We're doing some work, at least the biologists are doing some work now in Parkinson's. Some people work on aphasia, but, it's a very kind of specific focus on, neuroscience that Caltech has. Finding an author at Caltech wasn't really gonna work. Initially, I found someone at UCLA. She had a writing block. It took about 10 years to get to Bruce, to cut to the chase.
Wow.
Yeah. And then I wrote another academic book in between. So I needed to find the right person. And then someone told me about Ken Kosick at Santa Barbara. And I contacted him and sent him a couple things I'd written, and he really liked what I wrote. But the only time I could talk to him was at an airport because he was always dashing
Uh,
off to, conferences on FTD and whatever. So I had a feeling that wasn't going to work. And he said, "You should contact Bruce Miller because he really likes to write. And there's this amazing interdisciplinary group at UCSF that he put together. It's called the Memory and Aging Center at UCSF. It's called the MAC." So
mm,
I wrote an email to Bruce. I was going to be in Berkeley for a week or two over the summer. We met, totally hit it off. And he said to me the words that I had never heard. Do you want to learn some science? And it was funny because I had been at Caltech, but Bruce was like, "Do you want to learn some science?" And I was like, "Yeah, I want to learn some science." And he said, "Well, we've got this interdisciplinary program called the Global Brain Health Institute. Why don't you apply?" I applied. I got in. There were 14 people. I was the oldest. Most people were in their 30s and 40s. There was a architectural gerontologist who works on emergency rooms and making them friendlier for people with dementia. There were neuroscientists, geriatricians, people who worked on dance, photography. It was amazing. So from 2018 to 19, before the pandemic, I lived in San Francisco. My husband stayed in LA and we commuted. And I studied neurology for a year and it was amazing. It was amazing. I was a student. I went to classes twice a week. I went to grand rounds. I followed doctors. If patients were willing to let me sit in on their MOCA tests, I did that. It was just extraordinary. It was really extraordinary. And while there, Bruce and I would meet maybe once a month. I would write a section of the book and he would draft something in response. And my goal all along for the structure of the book was to have it be a back and forth between me and Bruce, kind of call and response. And it was going to be a memoir, but a dual memoir, which was kind of weird because my dad had died. Bruce didn't know my dad except for the memories I shared with him of my father. And I wanted Bruce's chapters to be what Bruce wanted them to be, but especially to explain the clinical presentations that I was describing, like what was going on or not going on in my dad's brain that would help readers understand like why he pointed the golf club in the wrong direction or why the odometer said a trip that should take 5 miles took 50 miles, why he pulled the bathroom sink out of the nursing home. Um, like and a lot of those memories that I had were ones that were told to me over the phone. Some I had witnessed. So when I first started at UCSF, the only thing I knew about Alzheimer's was that it was memory. It was about memory. So I thought the first chapter was going to be memory. Turned out that was the last chapter because in the course of writing it, Bruce was like, he became a literary critic and he said, "Well, these are really great chapters, but what's the narrative arc?" And it turned out the narrative arc was me remembering my dad before he got sick. So my dad losing memory, I lost memory, and writing the book helped me recover all these beautiful memories that I had of my dad that were just too hard for me to I
mhm.
kept them safe, but they were really too hard for me to access. And like the first chapter is diagnosis. I didn't know I was going to write a chapter on diagnosis, but years before my dad was sick, my mother took him to a hearing doctor. His hearing was fine. The doctor then asked my mother how long they'd been married. My mother said, "Oh, about 30 years." The doctor said, "He just doesn't want to listen to you anymore."
Oh
And
my
Bruce
goodness.
was like, "That goes in the book." So there's a chapter on diagnosis, word finding, spatial disorientation, behavior, and memory. And each memory that I retrieve and do kind of a close reading of, then Bruce talks about how the brain is working or not working. And he, like you, is an expert in all things dementia. So it's not just him talking about Alzheimer's, but about frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body, all of it. So that's kind of the structure of the book.
Wow. And it sounds like you were very happy with the result. I could imagine working with a neurologist and it not being as great as you would hope, but it sounds like it went really well.
Weirdly, COVID gave Bruce the time to write. Uh,
Amazing.
yeah, yeah. And Johns Hopkins, they have a really great health and wellness list with some of the really famous 36-hour day book was published by Hopkins. I thought we would maybe go with a popular press, but I kind of couldn't dumb it down enough for popular press. And it was
Okay.
so hard to write that at a certain point I thought I wrote it with Bruce. If it's published, fine. If not,
Mm.
and then Caltech gods intervened, and one connection led to another, and then Hopkins was like, "We want this book."
Well, congratulations. Like
Thank
amazing.
you.
I'm so happy that
Thank you.
and then you mentioned earlier that it was helpful. It sounds like it was therapeutic to go through that and very difficult
Yeah,
to go through that whole book writing process. And just writing a book alone, I understand, is like one of the toughest things and the getting it published and it goes on and on and on, right? So
yeah,
with the emotional and
yeah,
all of that, can you speak to that experience?
sure. It's interesting. The easiest chapter for Bruce to write was the behavior chapter because frontotemporal dementia, oftentimes the clinical presentations are behavioral. So that was his easiest chapter. That was my hardest chapter because so much of my dad's behavior I learned about secondhand. And so writing it made me revisit my decision not to quit graduate school,
I
to
see.
stay in California when my dad was in Florida. And then the thing that I remembered as I wrote that chapter, I remembered a bunch of things, including uh, my dad had bruxism. And I had turned that sound off in my mind. And it was only when I revisited his behavior that I remembered that sound. And
Wow.
it's hard to write sound, very hard. And I was determined in that chapter to hear that sound as
Wow.
clearly as I could. And because I'm a literary critic and I interpreted that sound as the sound of my father's pain. And I think that was part of it. I think there were probably all sorts of other reasons. He was like, I talk about big pharma's dream come true. Like they gave him so much medicine, so much that maybe the bruxism was a function of that. I don't know. In any event, it was therapeutic that in looking at, and I don't you're a psychiatrist, so maybe you know how this works, but in confronting the hardest memories, I was able to get to the really beautiful ones. But, like, I had to, like, go through this horrible path to get there. And I think just to feel everything that I refused to feel for so long, that the upside to it was getting to, you know, feel all of the beautiful things that my dad had given me in the 25 years I had with him before, the, things hit the fan.
So a few things came up I want to mention for the audience. So bruxism, so I think of teeth grinding, like
Yeah.
that kind. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and that does generally seem like it's a person's in distress, clenching their
Right.
jaw. So
Yeah.
that's very visceral, or the
Yeah.
sensory
Yes.
aspects of that is really powerful. And then, of course, the sound connected closely to the memories, your memories,
Right.
powerful.
Yeah. Right.
And then I think about, the grief and gratitude pairing and
Yeah.
your, I guess I don't think of, I mean, you can say you refuse to like confront or deal with the stuff, but I think you had your process. Like and that, it was so painful.
Yeah.
Like you were dealing with it. You just weren't conscious of it. Something was happening. And then you
Interesting.
produced this beautiful work of art and you're helping all these people. Like, so it wasn't like just you were like numbed out, unless you were, like some people use substances and numb out for years and years and
Yeah.
they don't progress. But,
Right.
and
Thank
I
you.
always just, I've said this multiple times. So my mother died when I was 17 of ovarian cancer. I'm now in my 40s, and I met a friend who's had a parent die when he was in his 20s, and I was like, yeah, it's really hard for like 20 years. Like something at like 20 years and maybe like 20, it starts like breaking through. And then by
Yeah.
25 years, I guess like if I think about it, because now for me it's 30 years this year. Like, so the last 5 years have been really like, it's not so, I'm not constantly revisiting it,
Right.
or that time.
Right.
Time, as they call it,
Yeah.
but but I know people might not wanna, "Oh my gosh, 20 years it's gonna take or 25
Right.
years," but
Yeah.
you're still living your life and having a good
Right.
life,
Yeah.
and the things
Exactly.
you
Yeah.
and who you've become and what you can
Right.
do is amazing, right? When you go through that, keep moving through it, and have these beautiful memories that you said you have been able to access, which,
Right. Thank you.
yeah, that's beautiful. So a question would be, do stories, as a writer and, accomplished writer and teacher, do stories and metaphors still matter when memory becomes unreliable?
So I'm going to do the English professor thing. To whom? Matter to whom?
Yeah. Well, I'm just gonna let you answer that, however.
That is funny. Okay. I love that. So they totally matter to anyone willing to take the time to read and to occupy the position of the other. So I'm thinking in particular here, I teach a course called The Literature of Crisis.
Wow.
And we read Beloved, we read Sound and the Fury, and a bunch of other books. And then we end with Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking,
Mhm.
which is for me sort of the gold standard of books about grief. And if I could write like that, I would. And the students got
Oh.
so much out of that book. And one of the students wrote this beautiful essay on her own relationship to grief using Didion's way of talking about grief. And it helped that student. She said she had never written anything about her grandmother dying, what it was like. And I think in occupying the experience of Didion's grief by being a good reader, a good close reader, she was able to access her own
Mhm.
and it helped her process her own. So I think it can have a direct relation like that. I mean, for me, my go-to book is Moby Dick. I've spent my life working on Moby Dick. I read it for the first time in high school, and it's kind of my thermometer, my emotional thermometer. So when my dad was sick, and this is kind of speaking to what you were saying, like I am very hard on myself that I wasn't confronting directly what was happening with my dad, but I was in this other way. And I remember understanding Ahab so well. And my chapter on word finding is called Call Me Ahab, which of course is a riff on the first three words of Moby Dick, Call Me Ishmael. And I just wanted to find the white whale, and it was right in front of me. It was my dad's Alzheimer's. and I just wanted to kill it so badly. And I knew that I was completely off kilter. I knew that I wasn't supposed to identify with Ahab. I was supposed to identify with Ishmael. And when and I have been for a while now, more in a state of equilibrium, understand and identify with the character I'm supposed to, if you know what I mean. And so for me as a literary critic, obviously stories are really essential. I'll tell an interesting story about getting the book published. I have this funny, because I thought the book was so sad, I needed to put something funny in whenever possible. So when I was in Berkeley, I was on Wheel of Fortune.
Wow.
And it was not my finest moment because I was one of those people who went to solve the puzzle and got it wrong.
No.
And I got one letter wrong. And I write about how, for a moment, my control over language had kind of diminished, and understanding my father never knowing the letters, never knowing the words. And and it was a really important story to tell for a bunch of reasons, mostly because it was so funny. And the Hopkins editor didn't want it in there. They're like, it's too much story, too much narrative. Like, I was like, no, it needs to stay there. The story needs to stay there. So I think story and metaphor um, help translate the difficult experience that you're going through. Writers are, like Percival Everett and Melville, they're smarter than I am. And if they have the words, and the neurologists, like PET scans tell stories, and um, learning the different ways that the story of the brain can be told, the story of the person with the sick brain and the story of the caregiver whose brain is undoubtedly affected. Like caregivers often die before the person they're caring for dies. So I think stories and narrative medicine, and if doctors are willing to just hear a story, and that's something that I encourage. I'm always very careful when I know doctors are in the audience, but before you start talking about the MRI and the PET, to be able to say to the family, why are you here? Tell us like an example of why you're here. I think that acknowledging the agency of the family and all this is really important for the doctor to do. And I know with our healthcare system, there isn't often time, but if you can just take a few minutes, I think giving the family the opportunity to tell their story can be really valuable.
Beautiful. And you do that in the support groups that you're leading.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you could I'm curious how every support group leader hosts it differently or facilitates differently,
Mm.
given your background and life experiences. Yeah.
I think the the main thing is to not have an agenda going into it other than to listen,
Hmm.
and to it sounds so corny, but just to, provide a safe space, and to provide a space where there isn't judgment, the guilt that so many caregivers have, like I only went to see my dad or my spouse 3 times this week in the memory care unit, and I wanted to go 7, or something like that. And just to let people know that it's okay. And I think because my own experience of kind of having such a indirect way of feeling my dad's pain and feeling my own, I guess if I were to have an agenda, it would be to create an environment where people feel okay about however they're feeling.
Hmm.
So I find the hardest part of the support group is how to end it.
Yeah.
That's tricky. I think I've gotten better at it. I'm not great in the classroom either at the end of the quarter, like wrapping things up and tying it with a ribbon, and so that kind of carries into the support group, but I've gotten better at it. And I really know my dad would have wanted me to do this. And so I always have felt like if I can be helpful to one person, like mission accomplished. I'm really happy with that.
Great. And if you could, wave a magic wand with our healthcare system and have um, caregivers get more of what is actually going to help them, what would that look like? What would that be? What would the top priorities be?
That is a very interesting question. I think because I give out grades, I think about grades a lot and like you don't have to get an A every time.
Mm,
That everyone is doing their best.
mm,
And I think even if you, as a caregiver, lose your temper or, have this ideal of uh, how you should be the A+ caregiver, just let it go. That's one thing, just let it go. I also remember this class I took at UCSF. This one doctor who specializes in biomarkers said something really liberating because, and as a psychiatrist, I don't know how you feel about this, but like if the person with dementia like says something mean or is apathetic or whatever, I think because we live in a culture so steeped in Freudianism and psychology, like the caregiver thinks they've always thought that. And now that they're,
there's no filter.
right,
Yeah.
now that there's no filter, their true feelings are coming out. No, it's the disease that's coming out. And to just try and remember that.
Mm,
I mean, maybe maybe there is some truth to what they're saying, and if they weren't sick, they wouldn't say it or whatever. Like someone who, made herself a punching bag for so many years, like it doesn't help. It really, really doesn't help to take it personally, or to attribute intention. There's a wonderful book that I just want to mention by this woman, Dasha Kuiper, who it's called Travelers to Unimagined Lands, and it's a series of caregiver chapters.
oh,
And she talks about our drive to attribute intention all over the place and how that can be really misguided. So I would suggest that. And
can I
yeah,
just so you're saying we're inclined to try to ascribe meaning to everything, but it's just whatever, and it's probably often a delusion. Well, maybe that's an extreme word,
right,
but
right,
or not.
right, exactly. And as someone who ascribes meaning for a living, it's ironic
Yeah.
for me to say this. I realize that. No,
Sorry, I interrupted you. Yeah.
no, 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 it's all good. It just the person is, it's just they're there, their love is there, whatever. There's just no point in taking one thing said at a
Yeah.
particular moment in time as the truth.
Mm,
That's all I mean.
yeah.
And the
Perfect.
truth is that they're sick. That's the truth. And I think that that's really all you need to know. So that's another suggestion. I think having healthcare professionals talk to families about advance directives is
Mm,
really important. So those are just a few things.
those are great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
So
Danny.
wonderful talking to you.
Same. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. And I know our audience would love to know where to find you, and you can tell us where to get your books.
Sure. So here's my book by me. It's a picture
Beautiful.
of me and my dad when I was really little. And then on the top, Bill Seeley, who's a neurologist at UCSF, gave us this beautiful image of these neurons. I
Beautiful.
forget. Yeah. So you can get the book at the Hopkins Press, Bookshop, obviously Amazon, and my email is caw@caltech.edu. And if anyone's listening and wants to touch base or wants to hear about the support group, which is
Great.
free and it's on Zoom, there are a couple steps that you need to take to access it. And HFC has many support groups, not just on grief. There are all sorts of groups, and they are all free and wonderful. I'd be happy to share that information.
Great. Yep, we'll include all of that in the show notes.
Great, thank you.
Clarity for Charity is amazing and
Yes,
does so much amazing stuff. They're
yes,
really creating, they've incited a huge change, and that's happening, and I'm excited to
yes.
be part of that in some way. So wonderful. All right. Well, thank you again. And
Thank
thank
you.
you for the listeners. If you like, subscribe, rate, and review our podcast so we can get out to more listeners. And you can find me and more about Brain Love at mybrainlove.com. So have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, Danny.